August 27th, 1979. A bomb hidden beneath the deck of a fishing boat explodes off the coast of Ireland. Lord Louis Mountbatten, one of the most powerful men in Britain, is blown to pieces along with his grandson and a teenage crew member. The IRA claims responsibility within hours. But this wasn't just an assassination. It was the violent end of a dynasty built on secrets, manipulation, and blood. Because the Mountbatten family rose from disgraced German nobility to the inner circle of British royalty through calculated marriages and ruthless ambition. They presided over one of history's deadliest partitions, leaving millions dead. When that bomb detonated, it didn't just kill a man, it shattered a carefully constructed myth and revealed the darkness underneath. 3 generations, from royalty to ruin. The Mountbatten name was a fabrication, a rebrand, a marketing strategy for a family that needed to distance itself from its German origins during a time when being German in Britain could get you killed. The family was originally called Battenberg, a minor princely house from the Grand Duchy of Hesse in what is now Germany. They were nobility, but not particularly important nobility, one of dozens of small royal families scattered across the fragmented territories of 19th century Germany. They had titles, castles, histories stretching back centuries, but they lacked real power. The Battenbergs understood something fundamental. In the modern world, proximity to power was more valuable than ancient bloodlines. Prince Louis of Battenberg was born on May 24, 1854, in Graz, Austria, the son of Prince Alexander of Hesse, and by Rhine and Julia Hauke, a Polish countess. The marriage was morganatic, meaning Julia's lower rank meant that Louis and his siblings could not inherit their father's grand ducal title. They were given the lesser title of Battenberg instead, a new creation, a consolation prize. Louis understood from childhood that he would have to make his own way in the world. Titles alone wouldn't be enough. He needed a strategy. At the age of 14, in 1868, he joined the Royal Navy. It was an unusual choice for a German prince, but Louis had identified Britain as the rising power of the era. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land mass and population. The Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force ever assembled, and the British royal family, particularly Queen Victoria, had extensive connections throughout European nobility. Louis saw opportunity. He learned English, adopted British customs, and worked his way up through the naval ranks with methodical determination. He was talented, disciplined, and politically astute. He understood how to navigate the complex hierarchies of the Royal Navy, how to cultivate the right sponsors, how to make himself indispensable. In 1884, he married Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, the daughter of Princess Alice of the United Kingdom and granddaughter of Queen Victoria herself. The marriage was a masterstroke. It gave Louis direct access to the British royal family, transforming him from a minor German prince serving in the Royal Navy into a member of the extended British royal family. Queen Victoria approved of the match. Louis was charming, competent, and clearly devoted to Britain. The fact that he was German seemed irrelevant. Europe's royal families were all interconnected anyway, a vast web of cousins and second cousins who married each other to cement alliances and maintain bloodlines. Louis and Victoria had 4 children. Alice, born in 1885. Louise, born in 1889. George, born in 1892. And Louis, nicknamed Dickie, born in 1900. The children grew up in Britain, educated at British schools, surrounded by British aristocracy. They spoke English as their first language. They considered themselves British, even as they carried German titles and German blood. Louis's strategy was working. The Battenbergs were becoming British. Louis's naval career flourished. He was promoted steadily, commanding ships and then fleets, demonstrating both tactical skill and political savvy. By 1912, he had reached the pinnacle. First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy, the highest position a career naval officer could achieve. He was the first person born outside Britain to hold the position. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to decades of hard work and strategic positioning. Louis of Battenberg had made it. The minor German prince had become one of the most powerful military figures in the British Empire. And then came World War I. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side, Britain, France, and Russia on the other. Suddenly, Louis of Battenberg's German heritage, which had seemed like a minor detail in peacetime, became a massive liability. Anti-German sentiment swept through Britain with terrifying speed. German shops were vandalized. German-sounding names were changed. Anyone with German connections was viewed with suspicion. And Louis, the first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, was German-born, with a German title, and German relatives fighting on the other side. The press attacked him viciously. Rumours circulated that he was a German spy, that he was sabotaging British naval operations, that he couldn't be trusted. The allegations were absurd. Louis had served Britain faithfully for over 4 decades. He was married to Queen Victoria's granddaughter. His children were British. But none of that mattered. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1914, his German origins were enough to condemn him. The pressure mounted. Politicians called for his removal. Newspapers demanded his resignation. Even some of his colleagues in the Admiralty began to distance themselves. On October 28, 1914, Louis resigned as First Sea Lord. He released a statement. "I have lately been driven to the painful conclusion that at this juncture my birth and parentage have the effect of impairing in some respects my usefulness on the Board of Admiralty. In these circumstances I feel it to be my duty to resign, in order to facilitate the task of the administration of the great service, to which I have devoted my life, and to ease the burden laid on His Majesty's ministers." It was dignified, gracious, and heartbreaking. He had done nothing wrong. His only crime was being born in the wrong country. The resignation devastated him. He had built his entire life around service to Britain, and Britain had rejected him. He retreated from public life, living quietly with his family, nursing his humiliation. But he never stopped being loyal to his adopted country. He never returned to Germany. He never spoke bitterly about his treatment. He simply endured. The family endured with him, but they understood that something had to change. The Battenberg name was toxic. It was German. It was foreign. It marked them as outsiders in the country they considered home. In 1917, King George V, facing similar pressure about his own German heritage, announced that the British royal family would renounce all German titles and adopt an English surname. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha became the House of Windsor, a name chosen for its thoroughly English associations. The king invited his German-born relatives to do the same. Louis accepted immediately. On July 14, 1917, by royal warrant, Prince Louis of Battenberg became Louis Mountbatten, 1st Marquess of Milford Haven. The name Mountbatten was a literal English translation of Battenberg, both meaning mountain stream. It was a cosmetic change, but symbolically enormous. The Battenbergs ceased to exist. The Mountbattens were born, thoroughly English, untainted by German associations, ready to rebuild. Louis didn't live long enough to see the full rehabilitation of the family name. He died on September 11, 1921, at the age of 67, his health broken by years of stress and disappointment. But he had set the stage for his children, particularly his youngest son Dickie, to achieve what he could not: total acceptance into the highest levels of British society. Dickie Mountbatten was born on June 25, 1900, at Frogmore House in Windsor, a royal residence lent to the family by Queen Victoria. From the moment of his birth, he was surrounded by royalty. His great-grandmother was Queen Victoria. His godparents included future kings and queens. His childhood playmates were princes and princesses. He grew up in a world of palaces and privilege, but also in a world of uncertainty. The Battenberg fortune was modest compared to other royal families. His father's career, though successful, had been built on merit rather than inherited wealth. The family had status, but they needed to maintain it, to constantly prove their worth, to justify their place in the upper echelons of society. Dickie understood this from an early age. He was charming, intelligent, and strikingly handsome. Tall, with chiseled features and perfect posture, he looked like he had been designed by central casting to play a British naval officer. He was also deeply ambitious, with an almost obsessive need to succeed, to prove himself, to exceed his father's achievements. When his father resigned in disgrace in 1914, Dickie was only 14, but the humiliation burned into him. He would spend the rest of his life ensuring that the Mountbatten name would never be questioned again. He followed his father into the Royal Navy, attending the Royal Naval College at Osborne and then Dartmouth. He was a mediocre student academically, but socially he was brilliant. He cultivated friendships with his royal relatives, particularly his cousin David, who would later become King Edward VIII. He understood that in the Navy, as in life, connections mattered as much as competence. He worked hard to be liked, to be remembered, to stand out. And he succeeded. By the time he graduated in 1916, during the height of World War I, he was already known as one of the most promising young officers in the service. His wartime service was distinguished, but not exceptional. He served on battleships and cruisers, saw action in several engagements, and earned the respect of his superiors. But he didn't distinguish himself in combat the way his father had. Dickie's real talent wasn't tactics or strategy, it was people. He knew how to read a room, how to identify who mattered, how to make himself useful to powerful men. He was a networker, a politician in a naval uniform, and he was extraordinarily good at it. After the war, he continued climbing the ranks, but his real breakthrough came in 1922 when he married Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Britain. Edwina was the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Cassell, a German Jewish financier who had made an enormous fortune advising King Edward VII and investing in railroads, banks, and industry around the world. Cassell had died in 1921, leaving an estate valued at over £7 million, equivalent to approximately £400 million in today's currency. Edwina, as his favourite granddaughter, inherited the bulk of it. The marriage was a sensation. It combined Dickie's royal connections with Edwina's immense wealth, creating one of the most powerful couples in British society. The wedding took place on July 18, 1922, at St. Margaret's, Westminster, with a guest list that included King George V, Queen Mary, and representatives from royal families across Europe. It was a statement. The Mountbattens had arrived. They were no longer the disgraced Battenbergs. They were British aristocracy, wealthy, connected, and untouchable. Edwina's inheritance allowed them to live on a scale that even most aristocrats couldn't match. They moved into Brook House, a massive mansion at 23 Park Lane in London, overlooking Hyde Park. The house had 30 bedrooms, a ballroom that could accommodate 400 guests, a Turkish bath, and an art collection that rivaled national museums. They filled it with treasures from around the world, paintings by old masters, furniture from French palaces, jade sculptures from China, Persian rugs worth fortunes. They hosted parties that became legendary in London society, events where cabinet ministers mingled with movie stars, where Indian Maharajas danced with American heiresses, where the champagne never stopped flowing and the music played until dawn. But beneath the glamour, the marriage was complicated. Edwina was brilliant, restless, and deeply dissatisfied with the traditional role of aristocratic wife. She was more intelligent than most of the men in her social circle, more politically engaged, more interested in the world beyond the ballrooms and country estates. She threw herself into humanitarian work, traveling to disaster zones and refugee camps, working with the Red Cross and other charities. She was genuinely committed to helping people, but she was also trying to escape the suffocating confines of her gilded cage. She also had affairs, many affairs, with politicians, artists, adventurers, anyone who interested her. The most famous was with Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, a relationship that began when Dickey was Viceroy and continued for years afterward. They exchanged hundreds of letters, met whenever possible, and were clearly deeply in love. Dickey knew, everyone in their circle knew, but it was tolerated, even facilitated because Nehru was useful. He was the leader of the largest democracy in the world, an important ally, a connection worth maintaining. Dickey's relationship with his wife had long since evolved from romance into partnership, a strategic alliance for mutual benefit. She brought money and glamour. He brought royal connections and political power. What they did in their private lives was their own business. Dickey had his own relationships, though he was more discreet than Edwina. There were persistent rumors throughout his life that he was bisexual, that he had affairs with both women and men. FBI files declassified in 2015 contained reports from the 1940s alleging that Mountbatten was homosexual and had engaged in relationships with men, including fellow naval officers and members of high society. The files were based largely on gossip and hearsay, but they were extensive and detailed. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, clearly believed the allegations were credible enough to keep investigating. Whether they were true remains a matter of historical debate. Dickey never publicly addressed the rumors. In the Britain of the 1940s and 1950s, homosexuality was illegal, a criminal offense that could destroy careers and reputations. If Dickey did have relationships with men, he took those secrets to his grave. What is certain is that Dickey and Edwina's marriage was a performance, carefully choreographed for public consumption. In public, they were the perfect aristocratic couple, glamorous, devoted, admired. In private, they led largely separate lives, pursuing their own interests and relationships while maintaining the facade of unity. It worked because they were both committed to the same goal, elevating the Mountbatten name, securing their place in history, building a legacy that would endure. They had 2 daughters, Patricia, born in 1924, and Pamela, born in 1929. No sons. This was a profound disappointment for Dickey, who had hoped for a male heir to carry on the Mountbatten name. British titles typically passed through the male line, and without a son, the earldom and other honours he would accumulate would eventually die with him, unless special arrangements were made. He petitioned the Crown to allow the titles to pass through the female line, which was eventually granted, but it rankled. He saw it as a failure, another way in which he had fallen short of his father's legacy. He compensated by doting on his daughters, particularly Patricia, the eldest. He groomed her to understand the importance of the Mountbatten name, to appreciate the weight of the legacy she would inherit. He also cultivated relationships with his nephews, particularly Prince Philip of Greece, who was the son of Dickey's sister Alice. Philip was penniless, effectively stateless, a prince without a kingdom. Dickey took him under his wing, arranged for his education in Britain, and actively promoted a marriage between Philip and Princess Elizabeth, the heir to the British throne. When the marriage took place in 1947, Dickey had achieved something extraordinary. He had placed his nephew on the throne of Britain. The Mountbattens were now directly connected to the line of succession. It was the culmination of everything his father had worked for, and more. But Dickey wasn't satisfied. He wanted personal glory, not just reflected glory through his relatives. He wanted his own place in the history books, his own achievements that would be remembered centuries from now. World War II gave him that opportunity. When war broke out in 1939, Dickey was a captain in the Royal Navy, commanding the destroyer HMS Kelly. He saw extensive action in the Mediterranean and North Sea, surviving several close calls, including the sinking of HMS Kelly off Crete in 1941. His performance was competent but not exceptional. He made tactical errors that resulted in unnecessary losses, but he also showed courage under fire and an ability to inspire his crews. More importantly, he was a master of public relations. He ensured that his exploits were well publicized, that journalists knew his name, that his service was seen as heroic rather than merely dutiful. In 1942, he was promoted to acting vice admiral and appointed chief of combined operations, responsible for planning amphibious assaults and commando raids against German-occupied Europe. It was a high-profile position that put him at the center of British military planning. He oversaw numerous operations, including the disastrous Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942, an amphibious assault on the German-occupied French port of Dieppe. The raid was a catastrophic failure. Of the 6,086 men who made it ashore, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured. The majority were Canadian troops. The objectives were not achieved. German defenses were barely scratched. It was one of the worst Allied defeats of the war. Mountbatten's role in planning the raid has been debated ever since. He claimed afterward that the raid provided valuable lessons that were applied to the D-Day landings in 1944, that the sacrifice was necessary to learn what worked and what didn't. Critics argued that the raid was poorly planned, that the intelligence was inadequate, that the risks were not properly assessed, and that the losses were entirely preventable. Either way, Mountbatten's reputation survived. He was too well connected, too politically valuable, to be held accountable. The failure was quietly buried, and Mountbatten moved on to his next role. In October 1943, he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command, responsible for all Allied operations in the region, including Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. It was one of the highest military commands of the war, putting Mountbatten in charge of over 1 million troops from multiple nations. The campaign to retake Burma from the Japanese was brutal, fought through dense jungle and monsoon rains against a fanatical enemy that refused to surrender. The British 14th Army, led by General William Slim, did the actual fighting, while Mountbatten handled logistics, politics, and coordination with American and Chinese allies. When the war ended in August 1945, Burma had been liberated, and Mountbatten was once again hailed as a hero. He was promoted to Rear Admiral and showered with honors from Britain and allied nations. He had medals from the United States, France, China, and numerous other countries. He had achieved fame, recognition, and a place in the history of World War II. But he still wasn't satisfied. He wanted something more, something that would cement his legacy beyond military service. And in 1947, the British government gave it to him. India. The British Empire was dying. World War II had bankrupted Britain, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and shattered the illusion of British invincibility. The colonies were restless. India, the crown jewel of the empire, had been demanding independence for decades. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had mobilized millions in civil disobedience campaigns. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was demanding a separate Muslim state. Britain could no longer afford to hold India by force. The question was not whether to grant independence, but how to manage the transition in a way that preserved British dignity and influence. The Labour government of Clement Attlee decided to appoint a new viceroy, someone with the prestige to negotiate with Indian leaders and the political skills to manage the process. They needed someone who understood both the British establishment and the changing global order. They chose Mountbatten. On February 20th, 1947, he was appointed the last Viceroy of India, tasked with overseeing the transfer of power from British to Indian hands. Mountbatten arrived in New Delhi on March 22, 1947, with Edwina and a large staff. They moved into the Viceroy's house, now known as Rashtrapati Bhavan, a palace so enormous that it made Brooke House look modest. The building had 340 rooms, 227,000 square feet of floor space, and gardens that stretched for acres. It was the physical embodiment of British imperial power, a monument to the idea that Britain would rule India forever. Mountbatten would be the last British official to live there. His original mandate was to hand over power by June 1948, giving him over a year to negotiate the terms of independence. But Mountbatten, confident in his ability to charm and negotiate, decided to accelerate the timeline. He believed he could achieve independence faster. That delay would only increase tensions and violence. He convinced the British government to move the date to August 1947, giving him less than 6 months to accomplish what was supposed to take more than a year. It was a catastrophic decision. The acceleration left no time for careful planning, for gradual implementation, for the kind of detailed preparation that such a monumental change required. The question of partition, whether to create separate Hindu and Muslim states, was still unresolved. The borders had not been drawn. The fate of princely states had not been determined. The logistics of separating two nations from what had been one were staggering in their complexity. And Mountbatten had given himself less than 6 months to figure it all out. He made it worse by forming a close personal relationship with Nehru, leader of the Indian National Congress, and soon to be the first Prime Minister of India. Nehru and Edwina began their affair during this period, spending hours together in private conversations, while Mountbatten negotiated with other leaders. The relationship gave Mountbatten unique access to Congress party thinking, but it also biased him in favor of the Congress position on partition. He became an advocate for a quick division rather than a mediator seeking the best solution. The actual partition plan was drawn up by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been to India before and knew nothing about the region's geography, demographics, or history. He was given 5 weeks to draw a border dividing the Punjab and Bengal into Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority regions. 5 weeks to split apart communities that had lived together for centuries, to decide which villages would go to India and which to Pakistan, to determine the fate of millions of people. Radcliffe worked from maps and census data, without visiting most of the regions he was dividing, without consulting local leaders, without understanding the human implications of the lines he was drawing. The borders were announced on August 17, 1947, 2 days after independence. Nobody knew where they were until that moment. Families didn't know which country they would wake up in. Villages didn't know whether they would be Indian or Pakistani. Cities were split, with the border running through neighborhoods and even through individual buildings. And the violence that followed was apocalyptic. Hindus and Sikhs who found themselves on the Pakistani side fled east. Muslims who found themselves on the Indian side fled west. But they weren't just fleeing. They were being driven out, attacked, murdered. Hindu and Sikh mobs massacred Muslim villages. Muslim mobs massacred Hindu and Sikh villages. Trains arriving at stations were found filled with corpses, every passenger slaughtered. Women were abducted, raped, and mutilated. Children were killed in front of their parents. The Punjab, one of the most fertile and prosperous regions of South Asia, became a killing field. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 1 million people. Some historians believe it was closer to 2 million. Between 10 and 20 million people were displaced, making it one of the largest forced migrations in human history. The violence continued for months, well into 1948, long after Mountbatten had left India and returned to Britain. Mountbatten's defenders argue that partition violence was inevitable, that centuries of Hindu-Muslim tensions were bound to erupt, regardless of how the process was managed. They argue that Mountbatten did the best he could under impossible circumstances, that he inherited a situation that was already spiraling out of control. His critics argued that the acceleration of the timeline was reckless, that the hasty border drawing was criminally negligent, that Mountbatten prioritized his own legacy over the welfare of the millions of people affected by his decisions. They point out that he left India on August 15, 1947, the very day of independence, before the violence had even peaked. He didn't stay to deal with the consequences of partition. He handed over power, took his accolades, and went home. He returned to Britain as a celebrated figure. He was created Earl Mountbatten of Burma, Viscount Mountbatten of Burma, and Baron Romsey of Romsey in the county of Southampton. The titles were a reward for ending the British Raj. The newspapers praised him. Politicians lauded him. He gave speeches about the peaceful transfer of power, about the friendship between Britain and the new nations of India and Pakistan. The millions dead or displaced were mentioned, if at all, as tragic but unavoidable casualties of a difficult historical transition. Mountbatten resumed his naval career, rising to become First Sea Lord in 1955, the same position his father had been forced to resign from 4 decades earlier. It was a full rehabilitation of the family name, a symbolic victory over the humiliation of 1914. He held the position until 1959, when he was appointed Chief of the Defence Staff, the highest military position in Britain. He advised Prime Ministers Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas Home on defence policy, oversaw the reorganisation of Britain's armed forces, and positioned himself as the elder statesman of British military affairs. He retired from active service in 1965, but he never really retired from public life. He remained a fixture at royal events, a regular presence at Buckingham Palace, an advisor to his great-nephew Prince Charles, who called him honorary grandfather. Edwina didn't live to see most of Dickie's later triumphs. She died suddenly on February 21, 1960, in Jesselton, North Borneo, now known as Kota Kinabalu, Malaysia. She was 58 years old. She had been on one of her many humanitarian trips, inspecting Red Cross facilities and meeting with local officials. She complained of feeling unwell, went to bed early, and died in her sleep. The official cause was a heart attack brought on by exhaustion. She had been traveling constantly for years, working herself to the point of collapse, driven by a need to do something meaningful with her life beyond being a decorative accessory to her husband's career. Her death devastated Dickie, or at least he appeared devastated. He organized a grand funeral, ensured she was buried at sea according to her wishes, and spent the rest of his life referring to her in glowing terms as a humanitarian saint. Whether he genuinely mourned her or mourned the loss of the partnership they had built is impossible to say. Their marriage had been unconventional, possibly loveless in the traditional sense, but it had been effective. Together they had built the Mountbatten brand. Without her, Dickie was alone at the center of the web he had spent his life constructing. He spent his final years dividing his time between London and Broadlands, the magnificent country estate in Hampshire that had been part of Edwina's inheritance. Broadlands was a Palladian mansion set on 5,000 acres of parkland, with formal gardens, a working farm, and views over the River Test. It had been owned by the Ashley family for generations before passing to Edwina through her grandfather's will. Dickie loved Broadlands. He filled it with artifacts from his life. Paintings, photographs, medals, gifts from world leaders, naval memorabilia, souvenirs from India. It was part home, part museum, part shrine to his own achievements. He gave tours to guests, walking them through rooms and corridors while recounting stories from his life. He was a brilliant storyteller, captivating, entertaining, larger than life. He was also a relentless self-mythologizer, embellishing details, exaggerating his role in events, quietly editing out his failures and mistakes. He was building his legacy in real time, constructing the narrative of his life the way he wanted it remembered. He worked on his memoirs, granted interviews to sympathetic biographers, and carefully controlled access to his papers and archives. He was obsessed with how history would remember him. He wanted to be seen as a great man, a statesman, a military hero, a trusted advisor to the crown. He wanted the Mountbatten name to endure for generations, to be spoken of with the same reverence as Wellington or Nelson. He spent enormous amounts of time and energy on this project, curating his image with the same attention to detail he had once applied to naval operations. Every summer he took his family to Classiebawn Castle, a holiday retreat in County Sligo, Ireland, on the northwest coast. The castle had been built in the 1870s by Lord Palmerston, a former British Prime Minister, and had passed through several owners before being acquired by the Mountbatten family. It was remote, perched on a hillside overlooking Donegal Bay, surrounded by rugged countryside and small fishing villages. Dickie loved it for precisely that remoteness. It was a place where he could escape the pressures of London, where he could relax and enjoy simple pleasures like fishing. Every morning during his stays, he would take Shadowfeave out into the waters off Mullaghmore. It was a routine, predictable, and peaceful. He would board the boat around mid-morning, sometimes alone, sometimes with family members or friends. They would fish, enjoy the sea air, and return to the castle for lunch. It was one of the few times in his life when Dickie truly relaxed, when the relentless ambition and self-promotion faded into the background. But Ireland in the late 1970s was not a peaceful place. The Troubles, a violent conflict over the status of Northern Ireland, had been raging since the late 1960s. The Provisional IRA was waging a guerrilla war against British rule, targeting British soldiers, police officers, and anyone they perceived as representing British imperialism. They had bombed cities, assassinated officials, and created a climate of fear and uncertainty throughout Northern Ireland and parts of the Republic of Ireland. Mountbatten had been warned repeatedly by security services that he was a potential target. He was one of the most high-profile British figures alive, related to the Queen, a former military commander, a symbol of British power and prestige. His regular visits to Ireland were well known. His daily boat trips were predictable. He was, in security terms, an easy target. But Mountbatten dismissed the warnings. He had been visiting Classiebawn for decades. He knew the locals. He believed they liked him, that his presence in the area was appreciated, that his ownership of the castle brought jobs and tourism to the region. He thought he was safe. He was catastrophically wrong. The IRA didn't care about his personal relationships with local people. They saw him as a legitimate target, a representative of British imperialism who deserved to die. In the weeks before August 27, 1979, IRA operatives surveilled his movements, noting his routines, planning their attack. They acquired explosives, assembled a bomb, and waited for the right moment. On the night of August 26th, they placed the bomb on Shadow 5, hiding it beneath the deck and wiring it to a remote detonator. The boat was moored at the public dock in Mullaghmore, easily accessible, unguarded. The bomb sat there overnight, armed and ready, while Mountbatten slept at the castle, unaware that his life would end the following morning. August 27th dawned clear and calm, perfect weather for a boat trip. Mountbatten gathered his family for the outing: Patricia, John, the twins Nicholas and Timothy, and the dowager Lady Brabourne. Paul Maxwell, the teenage crew member, arrived early to prepare the boat. They boarded around 11 a.m., chatting and laughing, looking forward to a pleasant morning on the water. Shadowfy left the harbour and headed out into Donegal Bay, moving slowly through the calm waters. On the cliffs above the harbour, an IRA member watched through binoculars. They waited until the boat was far enough from shore, ensuring maximum casualties and minimal risk to anyone on land. At 11:39 a.m., they pressed the button. The explosion was heard for miles. 50 pounds of gelignite detonated simultaneously, releasing a blast wave that tore through the wooden boat like paper. The hull shattered into thousands of pieces. The deck lifted into the air and disintegrated. Metal fittings became shrapnel, slicing through everything in their path. The passengers were thrown into the water, some already dead, others critically injured, all surrounded by debris and wreckage. Local fishermen saw the explosion and raced to the scene. They pulled bodies from the water, desperately searching for survivors. Mountbatten was found quickly, his body catastrophically injured. Both legs were nearly severed. His chest and abdomen were torn open by shrapnel. He was unconscious, barely breathing. They lifted him into a boat and raced back to shore, where emergency services were already assembling. An ambulance rushed him toward the hospital, but he died en route. He never regained consciousness. Nicholas Knatchbull, 14 years old, was found floating face down in the water. The explosion had killed him instantly. His twin brother, Timothy, floating nearby, was critically injured, but alive. Paul Maxwell's body was recovered later in the afternoon. The Dowager Lady Brabourne was pulled from the water alive, but died the following day from her injuries. Patricia and John Brabourne survived, though both suffered serious injuries and profound psychological trauma. The news reached London within the hour. Queen Elizabeth II was informed immediately. She was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland on her annual summer holiday. The news devastated her. Mountbatten had been a constant presence in her life, a link to previous generations of the royal family, an advisor and confidant. Prince Philip, his nephew, was shattered. Prince Charles, who had been mentored by Mountbatten and considered him a father figure, was inconsolable. The British public reacted with shock and outrage. This wasn't just another IRA attack. This was the murder of a member of the royal family, an elderly man killed while on a family outing. The brutality of the attack, the fact that a 14-year-old boy and a 15-year-old crew member had been killed alongside him, intensified the anger. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher condemned the attack in the strongest possible terms, calling it an act of evil and barbarous depravity. The IRA showed no remorse. Their statement framed the killing as a legitimate military operation against a representative of British imperialism. They pointed out that British forces had killed hundreds of Irish civilians over the years, that British security forces had tortured and murdered IRA members, that the occupation of Northern Ireland was itself an act of violence. From their perspective, Mountbatten was a legitimate target, and his death was justified. The funeral was held on September 5, 1979, at Westminster Abbey. It was a state funeral in all but name, one of the grandest ceremonies Britain had staged in years. The Queen attended, along with Prince Philip, Prince Charles, and most of the extended royal family. Representatives from governments around the world sent delegations. Former military colleagues, politicians, aristocrats, and foreign dignitaries filled the abbey. The coffin, draped in the Union Jack, and topped with Mountbatten's coronet and naval cap, was carried on a gun carriage drawn by Royal Navy sailors through the streets of London. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the route, paying their respects to a man they saw as a hero. The service itself was a magnificent piece of theatre. The music was grand, the eulogies were moving, the ceremony was perfectly choreographed to honour a man who had spent his life at the centre of British power. Prince Charles gave a reading, his voice breaking with emotion. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a sermon praising Mountbatten's service to Britain and to the Commonwealth. The Royal Navy sent a guard of honour. Military bands played. It was everything Dickie would have wanted. A spectacular final performance, a last opportunity for the Mountbatten name to be celebrated on the grandest stage. But beneath the pageantry, the family was destroyed. Patricia, who had survived the blast but lost her father and her son, sat in the front row of the abbey, her face a mask of grief. John Brabourne, beside her, was equally devastated. Timothy, still recovering from his injuries, was not well enough to attend. The family that Dickie had spent his life building, the dynasty he had worked so hard to establish, was shattered. Patricia inherited her father's titles and became Countess Mountbatten of Burma in her own right. She also inherited Broadlands and the bulk of her father's estate. But she had no interest in carrying on Dickie's legacy of self-promotion and political manoeuvring. She withdrew from public life almost completely, rarely giving interviews, avoiding the spotlight that her father had so eagerly sought. She lived quietly at Broadlands with John, opening parts of the house to the public to generate income for its upkeep, but remaining largely invisible herself. The house that Dickie had filled with the artifacts of his achievements became a tourist attraction, a museum where visitors could walk through rooms filled with photographs and medals and memorabilia from a bygone era. Broadlands hosted corporate events, weddings, and guided tours. It was a business, a way to preserve the estate and maintain the property, but it was a far cry from the glittering social centre it had been during Dickie and Edwina's reign. Timothy Knatchbull, the surviving twin, spent years processing the trauma of August 27, 1979. He later wrote a memoir, From a Clear Blue Sky, describing the explosion, the aftermath, and his long journey toward healing. He became a documentary filmmaker and author, quietly successful, but forever marked by the loss of his twin brother and great-grandfather. The book is heartbreaking in its honesty, describing the survivor's guilt, the nightmares, the PTSD, the slow realization that life would never be the same. But the tragedy of 1979 was only the most visible wound in the Mountbatten family's decline. The dynasty that Dickie had built was already crumbling from within, undermined by scandals, financial difficulties, and the slow revelation that the glittering facade concealed something much darker. The next generation of Mountbattens, the ones who were supposed to carry the legacy forward, became subjects of tabloid fascination and whispered scandal rather than respect and admiration. Norton Knatchbull, Patricia's eldest son, inherited the title of Baron Brabourne after his father's death in 2005 and became the third Earl Mountbatten of Burma after his mother's death in 2017. He had been groomed from birth to be the heir, educated at the finest schools, introduced to the royal family as a child, positioned as the future of the Mountbatten Dynasty. Norton married Penelope Eastwood, known as Penny, in 1979, just months before the assassination. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by royalty and aristocracy, a promising start to what should have been a model aristocratic marriage. Penny was beautiful, intelligent, well-educated, and perfectly suited to the role of future Countess Mountbatten. They settled into married life, had children, and seemed to embody the continuation of everything Dickie had built. Instead, their marriage became the subject of intense tabloid speculation and gossip, particularly surrounding Penny's extraordinarily close relationship with Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The friendship began in the 1990s through their shared interest in carriage driving, a niche equestrian sport that Philip had taken up after retiring from polo. Penny became his regular companion at carriage driving events, traveling to competitions around the country and across Europe, spending weekends at royal estates, photographed together constantly by the tabloid press. The relationship was unusual in its intensity and visibility. Penny spent enormous amounts of time with Philip, often more than she spent with her own husband. They were seen together at Windsor, at Sandringham, at Balmoral. They travelled together, competed together, celebrated victories together. The tabloids speculated endlessly about whether the relationship was sexual. Was 60-something Prince Philip having an affair with a woman 30 years his junior? The palace denied it categorically. Penny and Norton denied it. Friends of the couple insisted it was purely platonic, based on shared interests and mutual respect. But the denials didn't stop the rumours. The British press, and particularly the tabloids, love nothing more than a royal scandal, and the Penny Philip story had everything. An aging prince, a beautiful younger woman, a potentially cuckolded husband, and the whiff of sexual transgression. Whether the relationship ever crossed the line into a physical affair is unknown and probably unknowable, What is certain is that the constant speculation embarrassed the Mountbatten family and turned Penny into a tabloid fixture rather than a respected countess. Norton himself became the subject of scandal in 2010 when he suddenly left Penny and moved to the Bahamas with Eugenie Nuttall, a fashion designer 16 years his junior. The separation shocked British society. Norton had always been presented as the dutiful aristocrat, the responsible heir carrying on the family tradition. Instead, he abandoned his wife, his responsibilities, and his position, running off to the Caribbean in what looked like a mid-life crisis played out on a very public stage. He lived in the Bahamas for several years, while Broadland struggled financially and Penny was left to manage the estate alone. The tabloids had another field day. Was this revenge for Penny's relationship with Philip? Was Norton having his own affair? What would happen to the Mountbatten legacy? Eventually, Norton returned to Britain, reconciled with Penny, and resumed his role managing the estate. But the damage was done. The image of aristocratic stability and duty that the Mountbattens had cultivated for 3 generations was shattered. Their children faced their own tragedies and scandals. Their youngest daughter, Leonora, was diagnosed with kidney cancer at the age of 3. Despite the best medical care that money could buy, she died in 1991 at just 5 years old. The loss devastated Norton and Penny. Prince Charles and Princess Diana, who were close friends of the couple, attended the funeral. It was one of the last public events Diana and Charles attended together before their separation, a small detail that highlighted how intertwined the Mountbattens remained with the royal family, even as both families were falling apart. But the scandals that truly destroyed the Mountbatten reputation came from earlier generations, from revelations about Dicky himself and his brother George. George Mountbatten, 2nd Marquess of Milford Haven, Dicky's older brother, died in 1938 at the age of 45 from bone marrow cancer. But before his death, George had developed a reputation as one of the most debauched and dissolute members of the British aristocracy, a man whose appetites and proclivities shocked even his permissive social circle. George was a collector of pornography and erotica, on a scale that was extraordinary even by the standards of wealthy European aristocrats. When his estate was inventoried after his death, executors discovered a collection of thousands of photographs, books, prints, and artifacts from around the world. The collection included material that was illegal to own in Britain, including child pornography and images of extreme violence and degradation. It was so extensive and so shocking that parts of it had to be destroyed immediately to avoid legal complications. Dicky inherited the collection. According to some accounts, he not only kept it, but added to it over the years, though he was far more discreet than his brother about his interests. The collection remained at Broadlands for decades, hidden away in locked rooms, a secret known only to family members and a few trusted servants. Parts of it were eventually donated to museums or sold to private collectors, but the existence of the collection raised serious questions about both George and Dicky's sexual interests and practices. George's son, David Mountbatten, 3rd Marquess of Milford Haven, inherited the title and what remained of the family fortune, which by that point was much diminished. David married Janet Bryce in 1950 and had 4 children, but the Milford Haven branch of the family never achieved the prominence or wealth of Dicky's line. They were the poor relations, living on dwindling resources and fading prestige, always in the shadow of their more famous relatives. But it was the revelations about Dicky himself, emerging in the decades after his death, that inflicted the most damage on the Mountbatten legacy. The first cracks appeared in the 1980s as historians gained access to archives and began publishing more critical assessments of his career. The Partition of India was re-examined with a more skeptical eye. Biographers pointed out the acceleration of the timeline, the hasty border drawing, the lack of preparation for the violence that followed. They argued that Mountbatten had prioritized his own legacy over careful planning, that his vanity and ambition had contributed to one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. Then came the allegations about his personal life. In 2015, FBI files were released under the Freedom of Information Act, revealing that the FBI had investigated Mountbatten in the 1940s over allegations of homosexuality and sexual relationships with men. The files, compiled by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, were extensive and detailed. They included reports from informants claiming that Mountbatten was known in certain circles as a homosexual, that he had engaged in relationships with men including fellow naval officers, and that his marriage to Edwina was a cover for his true sexual orientation. The allegations were based largely on gossip and hearsay, and no conclusive evidence was ever produced. But the files were detailed enough that historians took them seriously. Some argued that Mountbatten was bisexual and had relationships with both men and women throughout his life. Others suggested the allegations were exaggerated or fabricated by political enemies or by Hoover himself, who was notorious for collecting damaging information about prominent figures. The truth remains unclear, obscured by decades, death, and Mountbatten's careful management of his own image. But far more damaging were the allegations that emerged in 2019 involving child abuse. Additional claims surfaced from other sources, including testimony from people who claimed to have been abused by Mountbatten or to have witnessed abuse. Some of these accounts were detailed and credible, others were vague or contradictory. The passage of time, the death of most witnesses and alleged victims, and the destruction of records make it impossible to definitively prove or disprove the allegations. What is certain is that the allegations have permanently tainted Mountbatten's reputation. Whether he was a pedophile who used his position to abuse vulnerable children or a victim of false accusations designed to destroy his legacy posthumously is a question that will probably never be definitively answered. But the mere existence of the allegations, combined with the known facts about his brother's collection of illegal pornography and the persistent rumors about his own sexual conduct, have made it impossible to view Mountbatten as the heroic figure he wanted to be remembered as. The Mountbatten dynasty today is a shadow of what Dickey envisioned. Norton Knatchbull, 3rd Earl Mountbatten of Burma, is a largely unknown figure outside aristocratic circles. He manages Broadlands as a business, hosting events and tourists, but he is not a public figure in the way his great-grandfather was. He is not an advisor to prime ministers or a mentor to princes. He is a landowner and businessman trying to preserve a historic estate in an era when such estates are increasingly anachronistic. The family's connection to the royal family endures, but is much weaker than it once was. Norton and Penny are invited to royal weddings and state occasions, but they are peripheral figures, not central players. Prince Philip, Penny's longtime companion and Dickey's nephew, died in April 2021 at the age of 99, severing one of the last strong personal connections between the families. King Charles III, who was mentored by Dickey and eulogized him as the grandfather I never had, is now focused on his own reign and his own family, with less time and inclination to cultivate the Mountbatten connection. The Mountbatten name itself has become more of a burden than an asset. It carries associations with colonial violence in India, with the Troubles and the IRA bombing, with sexual scandal and alleged abuse, with tabloid gossip and marital dysfunction. It is no longer a name that opens doors or commands automatic respect. It is a historical curiosity, a reminder of a bygone era when titles and aristocratic connections still mattered. I think what haunts me most about the Mountbatten story is how completely Dickey's vision has collapsed. He spent 7 decades building his legacy, obsessing over every detail, ensuring that his version of history would be the one that endured. He cultivated biographers, donated archives to institutions that would present him favorably, gave countless interviews, wrote memoirs. He was meticulous about controlling his image, about presenting himself as a hero and a statesman. And within a generation of his death, it all fell apart. The archives opened, historians asked harder questions, witnesses came forward. The Partition of India was re-examined, and Mountbatten's role was increasingly seen as disastrous rather than heroic. The FBI files revealed investigations into his sexuality. The Kinkora allegations raised the possibility that he was a predator. The myth he had so carefully constructed disintegrated, revealing something much darker and more complicated underneath. The bombing in 1979 should have been his martyrdom, the moment that enshrined him in British history as a tragic hero killed by terrorists. Instead, it became just another chapter in a story of decline. The family that survived him couldn't maintain the myth because they were too flawed, too human, too burdened by their own problems. Norton's separation, Penny's complicated relationship with Philip, the financial struggles at Broadlands, the revelations about Dickie's past, all of it chipped away at the Mountbatten mystique until there was nothing left but a title and an estate operating as a wedding venue. 3 generations. That's how long the Mountbatten Dynasty lasted. Prince Louis of Battenberg laid the foundation through decades of naval service and a strategic marriage. Dickie Mountbatten built the empire through relentless ambition, political maneuvering, and shameless self-promotion. And the 3rd generation inherited the ruins, trying to make sense of a legacy that turned out to be built on sand. The Mountbattens were never royalty, not really. They were ambitious, calculating operators who understood that proximity to power was more valuable than power itself. Dickie made himself indispensable to the British establishment, positioned himself at the center of every major event of the 20th century, and cultivated relationships with everyone who mattered. For a while it worked. He was the most connected man in Britain, the person who knew everyone, who could open any door, who could make things happen. But he built it all on a foundation of violence, manipulation, and secrets. The millions who died in the Partition of India, the sailors who died in operations he planned, the boys who may have been abused, the historical record he distorted to favor his own narrative. All of it was in service of the Mountbatten name, of building a legacy that would endure for centuries. And in the end, the name is all that remains. Not the glory, not the heroism, just a name, stained and contested and fading into irrelevance. The Mountbatten dynasty rose higher than almost any non-royal family in British history, and it fell just as far, from the Viceroy's palace to a wedding venue, from the inner circle of power to historical infamy, from royalty to ruin in 3 generations. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.